So the theme of the competition this year is innovation in clinical research, and we thought we would adopt that as our theme for our guest panel today. Innovation, though, is a word that seems to get used more and more throughout our industry and throughout everything that we do in our lives. At least that's my thought, but I'm a data guy, so I really wanted to check if that's true. So we're not to Google Books. I don't know if you're familiar with the Ngram viewer, but this is Google, for the last several years, has been cataloging every printed word ever written. As you can see here, there's a nice upward curve indicating that innovation is indeed a growing term in publications. But that's actually during the Industrial Revolution. And you would probably expect innovation to be a growing term during the Industrial Revolution. If you have a look at where we are today, after 100 years of pretty steady use of innovation, it's actually skyrocketed over the last 5 to 10 years in all of the different types of publications that we're all involved with. But is it real? What does it mean? I guess what I mean by that is, does the occurrence of the word innovation in a frequent setting in our publications have any correlation with actual innovation? To answer that, let's take a brief step back in time. We're going to go back before we all knew how to shake it off. Before there was a Girl on Fire, or a Taylor Swift, or a Jennifer Lawrence. Before we all had smartphones to get our constant updates from social media about what great food your cousin is making this week. Even before MySpace. You all remember MySpace, right? This is back at a time when the biggest companies of the world were the true blue chips. And judging by their logos, they actually had to be blue. There's only one tech company amongst the bunch that you see up there. There's no Amazons or Googles or Apples, no Alibaba. This was a time when this is how you recorded your clinical data. You all remember that, right? You had bookshelves with dozens of those lining the walls in your offices. When was this unthinkable era? This was 2005. In just a decade, we've gone from 0 iPhones to 10 generations of iPhones. We've seen an explosive use of social media. Uber, a company that didn't exist 7 years ago, is going to do 500 million rides this year. And companies like Patients Like Me are completely disrupting the way that we conduct clinical research and treat healthcare. So I would say that innovation is indeed real. Maybe we use the word a little bit too much, or times that it isn't truly innovative. But I think it's here, and it's probably going to impact our lives in ways that we don't even really understand right now. But to give 3 examples of things that we can understand. Let's talk about the Internet of Things. This is a slide that Jim Davis, the head of marketing for SAS, presented a couple weeks ago at the annual Health Analytics Executive Forum. You can see here that in 2013, there were about 10 billion connected devices to the Internet. Various industry groups are projecting by 2020 there will be 26 to 30 billion. But actually, Jim reported at this meeting that those projections have been changed now by 2-fold. And that in just 5 years, there'll be 60 billion devices connected to the Internet. So the Fitbits and the driverless cars and the talking refrigerators are going to change our lives. Now, some of these things I think are truly ridiculous. This is something I saw on TechCrunch earlier this week. An oblong device that you put in your pool so that it can tell your smartphone when it's okay to get in the pool. I've had one of those for my entire life. It's called my big toe. But some of them are truly life-saving. Anyone know who this is? It's Eric Topol, head cardiologist for the Scripps Clinic in San Diego. Eric Topol was actually the keynote at that forum that I mentioned earlier. And he actually almost didn't make the conference at all because on his plane ride in, a man on the plane had a cardiac event. And Eric was able to sustain him using his iPhone and a pocket ECG that he happened to be carrying around with him. I guess the moral of the story is if you're going to have a heart attack at 30,000 feet, it doesn't hurt to have the world's greatest cardiologist on board. Let's talk about gamification. We're in a constant state of trying to level up. Pay attention at school, get a sore point, be nice to your sister, get a token, go camping, get a patch for your vest. We have created a culture of incentivization and rewards that we need to adjust in order to learn how to treat the motivations of the digital native world. And for those of you in this world, how many of you have got your 10,000 steps today? And let's talk about crowdsourcing. I'm a huge fan of Kickstarter. I got Kickstarter salt. I don't know why you need to get salt on Kickstarter, but I do. My wife got me Kickstarter socks for Christmas. These headphones were crowdsourced, not on Kickstarter, but on another venue, where tons and tons and tons of audiophiles around the world actually designed these headphones. And they will play the crap out of anything that Beats has ever put out. This project here, the Pebble Time, this was just a project that was just completed. They were fully funded in 49 minutes. They raised $20 million to become the highest grossing Kickstarter of all time, selling 100,000 devices in their campaign. I'm on the list, but I don't have it here to show you today. But it's a true revolution in the way that we can, as a group, build and finance the devices and things that we want. And how does this play into clinical trials? So we are really good at talking about patient centricity as the hot topic. But how often are we actually involving the patient in the design of the clinical programs that we run? If this is something that we truly believe in, we're going to have to get to the point where they are part of the voice in the development plan. And as we all think about innovation, we also have to look around the room because our competitors aren't necessarily the people sitting to our right and our left. It's Silicon Valley, it's patients like me, it's companies that are truly disrupting what we do. And that's why I'm really glad to have 4 speakers today to come and talk to us about some of the things that they're doing in the tech space. But before we go there, we're going to talk about something that you might find rather analog, at least in the context of what we're here to present. I would actually argue that with this inundation of technology and data, our ways of communicating are ever more important. And that's why I'm going to have David Chapin come up and talk to us first. David is the CEO and Chief Strategist of Forma Life Science Marketing. After getting his BA in physics, he's gone on to get his master's in design from our very own NC State. He's named on over 40 patents in the US, and he's recently the author of this book, Making the Complex Compelling, Creating High-Performance Marketing in Life Sciences, which he published last year. David?
Thank you, Nick, for that wonderful introduction, and I will say that it is wonderful to be here. I appreciate it. These things always look seamless. Actually, they don't always look seamless. It takes a lot of work to put these kind of events on, and so kudos to Chiltern to making it look so seamless. Thank you. So let me see if I can figure out how to use this thing. All right, I want to talk today about patient centricity and the fact that when we put the patients at the center of a clinical trial, there's something that we have to pay attention to, which is the way patients want to be communicated with, and not only just patients, but all people. So raise your hand if you have training, scientific training, or if communicating something sciencey and technically is key to your success, right? Okay, so I'm in the right place. Now, I will say that the scientific worldview is incredibly powerful, right? It is what has doubled human average lifespan in the last 100 or so years. It is what gave us the internet and allows us to carry the internet around in our pocket. So I have a bachelor's degree in physics. I love science. I spend my working days and weeks helping companies make the complex compelling by working in the life sciences. So I'm not here to bash science. But I will say that the scientific worldview has limitations. We'll look at this by talking about drug development. Tufts recently said that it costs about $2.5 billion to develop a drug. Now, if you dive down a little bit, you realize that some of that cost is the opportunity cost, where the money could have been spent elsewhere. But okay, $2.5 billion. That's a lot of money. That's $1 you would receive from every man, woman, and child in China and India combined. We're talking serious dollars. We're talking able to buy a lot of serious science. With $2.5 billion, you could buy half of the Large Hadron Collider recently that came back online in CERN in Geneva, Switzerland. For $2.5 billion, you could see all the way back to the beginning of time because you could purchase the Hubble Space Telescope. This is big science that we're talking about. $2.5 billion, and where does that go? 57% of it is spent in clinical trials. And the number of trials is increasing, and yet recruiting patients is still the primary bottleneck. 86% of trials don't recruit on time. So it's no surprise when people talk about innovation or the change that's coming. And that change is going to come at us from many different directions, right? You can already see it in the way we talk about risk and how many visits it's going to take. You can see it in the way CROs are being put together. The business models of CROs now are starting to look like the business models of pharma companies, with the exception of some sales and marketing to clinicians, right? The way we recruit patients is changing. Walgreens is starting a clinical trial network. The overlap of social media and technology is going to change the way clinical trials happens. Apple, through their research kit, had 10,000 patients sign up for a cardiovascular trial overnight. Imagine being able to get 10,000 patients overnight. Boy, we could be choosy about which ones we let into the trial. Change is coming from everywhere, particularly from the sisters omics, the omics sisters, right? Genomics, metabolomics, proteomics, all those omics, increasing the number of targets that we're going to be able to address. I was talking with someone the other day who's in connection with the Gates Foundation. And the Gates Foundation, their limitation is in part money, because they have more drug candidates that they would like to put into the pipeline than they have money for. So finding lower cost ways to do this is really important to the Gates Foundation, and you wouldn't think that that would be a concern. And of course, patient centricity. But as we look at patient centricity, let's remember that there are different worldviews. The worldview of a patient or someone in the general population is very different than the worldview of a scientist. And similarly to the worldview of a marketer or a business person. And this difference was highlighted recently by Pew Research Center, which published a report. They went out and talked to lots and lots of people. You can see the number of adults and the number of scientists here. And they asked each about what they thought about the other. And when the public looks at science and scientists, they ask this question. And the answer was overwhelmingly clear. 79% said, for most people, science has made life easier. So when the public looks at science and scientists, it's a love affair. You flip it around, ask scientists how they see the public by asking this question: how much of a problem is it that the public doesn't know much about science? And the answer is equally compelling in the opposite direction. 84% of scientists say it's a major problem that the public doesn't know much about science. It's not a love affair, it's a heart attack. Ask scientists why. It's interesting where they put the responsibility for this issue. 75% of them say that a major reason that the public doesn't know much about science is that there's not enough education. K through 12, science, technology, engineering, and math education. 57% of them say that the major reason is lack of public interest in science news. And 43% of them say that it's a lack of media interest. So they're putting the responsibility everywhere else than at their own feet. Only 40% of them say that the problem, that the cause for the fact that the public doesn't know much about science is that too few scientists are doing a good job communicating. And my thesis is that this comes directly from the scientific worldview. I want to dissect that a little bit and show you what I've found. So what is the scientific worldview, right? You do an experiment, you get some data, and then you publish that data. And as you do so, the goal is to comprehend, describe, and predict. And so your focus is on the details and being complete. Because when you get the peer-reviewed comments back, it's, oh, you missed this, you didn't account for that. So the focus is on being detailed and complete. And then you publish it through the 3 Ps, podium presentations, poster presentations, and peer-reviewed publications. And the audience for that is other scientists. It's not the business community, it's not the general public. And this situation is actually, I've depicted it broader here than it really is, because if you're an oncogeneticist, you're gathering data that's related to oncogenetics, and so you're not talking to the epidemiologists or the microbiologists or the business community or the general public. You're talking to other oncogeneticists. And at the point you publish, scientists think, I'm done. I'm ready to do the next experiment. Go get funding. That's another notch on my CV. I'm done. So there isn't built into the scientific worldview this need to communicate clearly about what we do. Different worldviews, different goals, and different foci. The marketing worldview, the goal is to engage, communicate, and influence, so the focus is on creating a compelling big picture. Very different than a focus on details and completeness. Now, I think we would all agree that the marketing worldview does not produce great science. That's a gimme. The opposite is also true. The scientific worldview doesn't naturally attract, engage, and communicate. Which leads, and evidence for that is all around, right? Here's the website of a CRO. This is a former client. I've redacted the names to protect, we're not trying to make anybody feel bad, but quick, what do? You wouldn't know they were a CRO, right? The CEO of this CRO told me my goal was to answer every question on the homepage. I didn't want anybody to have to click. Well, if you've answered every question, there is no engagement. There's no reason for anyone to reach out and start a dialogue. Another bit of evidence for why the scientific worldview isn't really interested in compelling communication is that when a scientist is writing a peer-reviewed journal article, they don't care how long it takes us to read it. So we've got these 2 worldviews, and this brings up a really interesting question. If you're in a scientific and technical occupation, how can you communicate clearly whether the audience is the business community or the public or scientists? How do we attract and engage? If you ask a marketer, it's all about the brand, baby. I have a confession to make, one that will separate me from most other marketers. I hate the word brand. There are 4 mutually exclusive definitions. It's confusing. Let's strike it from our lexicon. What is the brand of clinical trials? Well, people who have participated in clinical trials would gladly do so again, 88% of them. But only 10% of Americans do so. Why? Well, not aware, lack of information, lack of trust, too risky. Those are engagement and communication issues. Those are not science issues. You ask a scientist about this issue of engagement and communication, and what do they say? I'm rational, I'm completely immune to marketing. Even though there's some wonderful scientific data that says no one is completely immune to marketing. Turns out that people that believe that Apple represents creativity more than IBM, this research comes out of Duke, it's really interesting. Apple, if you believe that Apple represents creativity more than IBM, then if I show you the Apple logo, I can actually increase your score on a standardized test designed to measure creativity more than people who are shown the IBM logo. And this will happen even when this exposure happens subliminally. You won't see the Apple logo, but you will be more creative if you believe that Apple represents creativity more than IBM. Did you see it? Do you feel more creative? Most of you are thinking, look, I'm rational. I'm immune to marketing, even though there's some wonderful peer-reviewed data that shows that if you have lesions in the ventromedial section of your prefrontal cortex, you won't be able to process emotional signals, but the rest of your basic cognitive functions are left untouched. And so without emotions, the quality of your decisions plummets. Emotions are necessary for decision making. So this idea that we can be rational and only talk to the rational part of patients, and the idea that we can be immune to marketing, that in fact is not borne out by the science. It's a non-rational attitude. We've got these different worldviews. They don't play well in each other's spheres, but they have similar ways to attract and engage. And I want to take this apart a little bit. I'll be using a little bit of marketing jargon for which I apologize. I'm not going to try to describe or define every term, but I want to talk about how reputation is built, because that is the way that we attract and engage. And we'll start with science, right? Scientists comes out of graduate school, they've got an interest, they've produced a paper or a poster, and they're attracting and engaging an audience. And this attraction and engagement happens because of expertise that the scientist has. They're the ones that know everything about the role of mosquito saliva in the transmission of malaria, or whatever that fascinating little thing is that they spent all their years of graduate school studying, right? And this science that they're doing is narrower than the scope of all the science they could do, and that, in fact, is what makes them attractive and engaging to the audience, because they've got this narrow specialty. And then they take that, and so there's this clear decision they make, this courageous mental act. I'm going to be the one that is the expert in the transmission of malaria. And they take that and they push it through multiple modalities, what in marketing we call touchpoints, and that creates an image in the minds of the audience. Oh, if you want to know the folks that are, man, transmission of malaria, oh, here are the people you need to talk to, right? They've built a reputation by standing on this expertise, and that expertise has to be unique, important, and relevant, and then they have to be consistent in the way they spread that word. And this is exactly the same mechanism that companies use to market themselves, and exactly the same way that audiences, like audiences of clinical trial potential respondents, find out about clinical trials. We'll start by looking at the audience, because we're taking the marketing view now. These people have issues in their life. They're searching for solutions. And so they're running into an environment full of competitors all yelling like mad, trying to attract attention. And as they do so, they've got questions. Can these people help me? Is this the right solution for me? And they continue to run into other things in the environment, like a website or content or PR. And in fact, Google's done some fantastic research that shows that for big ticket items, these audience members go typically through 57% of the purchase process before they ever reach out to a salesperson. So it used to be that salespeople had all the power. Caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. The internet has turned that on its head. It's now caveat venditor, let the seller beware. Because the buyer now has as much information, and in many cases, more information than the seller. And so here we are. We've got some unique value. We want to answer those questions for the audience. How do we do it? We do it by activating what we call the marketing mechanism of action, right? It starts by picking a position. This is a soapbox you're going to stand on. This is what will raise you above your competitors. Now that has to be narrower than the scope of your entire offering. I say Volvo, most people think, oh, they're the safe ones, right? Though Volvo also makes cars that are luxurious and roomy and fast, they don't advertise we're the luxurious, roomy, fast, safe ones, because that would be too confusing. We are the safe ones. And then that needs to get articulated and spread consistently through touch points, and will build an image in the minds of the audience. And most people, when I say Volvo, they think, oh, Volvo, they're the safe ones. Except there was a German CEO who made lab equipment once, and I said Volvo to him, and he said, oh, they're the ones that are always driven by little old ladies who drive 25 kilometers an hour below the speed limit. That's not safe at all, right? So this doesn't always work. Why? Let me see if this will, no. It doesn't always work because competitors are yelling. It's hard to be consistent in touch points. It's hard to do a good job articulating. It's really tough to make this courageous mental decision of what your soapbox is going to be, what your position is going to be. But one thing you can do to help yourself is to use these criteria as you make that decision. You have to be clear. You have to be unique. And then you need to be consistent in your use of touch points. And so this is how audiences understand what we stand for. And the problem is we're teaching our audiences to ignore us. Because here we are, we want to attract those audiences, but competitors are yelling. So what do? We start to yell. And the competitors say, well, they're yelling. What are we going to do? They start to yell. And then what do? We yell louder. What do these poor people in the middle do? That's you and I, by the way. What do? We try to develop filters, noise-canceling headphones to shut out the cacophony. So we're teaching our audiences to ignore us. More sophisticated communication leads to more sophisticated filters. I was in a focus group once talking with scientists about corporate identities in a particular sector. I think it was antibodies. And we had this fascinating discussion about the corporate identities of all the competitors in the space. And they could tell me which one looked like the company was the most stable, which one looked like it was the most innovative. It was really impressive. People are very sophisticated consumers. TV has taught us that, right? The advent of photography has taught us that. But one of the women looked at me and said, I don't look at logos. And I said, wait a minute. There's a logo on your pen. There's a logo on every Petri dish you pick up. There's a logo on every pipette. There's a logo on everything in your lab. What do you mean you don't look at logos? She said, well, okay, I may actually look at them, but I don't see them. They don't resonate with me because I'm immune to marketing. You don't if logos don't resonate, if you're immune, then none of this would mean anything. Really? You don't look at logos? Denial won't help. Science has great power, but relying only on science to talk to patients about clinical trials won't get us very far. There are hard challenges that have great science behind them. MRSA, right? Antibiotic stewardship is a huge issue. And there is clear science behind that. And we should not go to the doctor when we have a cold and ask for amoxicillin. But most people do. And take an even simpler answer with even simpler challenge with even simpler and more clear science. Getting people to wash their hands is really hard. So how can we attract and engage? It's not about the brand. Science points the way. There are all kinds of models of how people change. Prochaska has a wonderful model that shows how people actually engage and change their attitudes and beliefs. It starts with pre-contemplation, I don't have a problem, and moves into contemplation, well, this might be for me, but I'm not sure. And then you cross this dividing line and you get into actively making plans and getting ready to decide. And the thing is, in the pre-contemplation phase, your perception of the positives of change, the benefits that you'd get, are way smaller than your perception of the negatives. And that's why you're not changing, right? Because the negatives outweigh the positives. At the end of this process, your perception of the positives outweigh your perception of the negatives. And that's why you're willing to change, because the risk-reward ratio has flipped on its head. And so what we have to do is we have to take 2 steps to get people here. First, we have to increase their perception of the positives. And what that requires is inspiration. And then we have to decrease their perception of the importance of the negatives. And that requires reassurance. And so if we just, so what this means is we need to educate the unaware, and then we need to inspire the interested and reassure those with intent. And if we try to educate those who need reassurance, it's not going to work. And if we try to reassure those who need inspiration, it's not going to work. And so if we look at inspiration, top reasons people choose to participate in clinical trials: to advance medicine and to help improve the lives of others. There's inspiration there. And if you remember my slide about what the brand of clinical trials is, the top reason, lack of information. We need to do a better job of education. And the next 2 reasons, people need reassurance that everything's going to be okay. So we've got, and the top ways that people report finding out about clinical trials: where's the doctor? Where's the clinician? 5th in the list. And I've seen that 23%, in some reports as low as 5%. I think this is generous. But clinicians have this incredible social image, and we need to be harnessing that better, because we have different worldviews, patients and scientists. And we need to, they have different goals and different foci, and we need to recognize, understand, and harness these so that we can make the complex compelling. Thank you. So, I don't know if we have time for questions. Questions? I answered every question, so I've denied all engagement. Yes, please. Thank you.
In regard to speaking to the multimedia and how it's vastly kind of channeled or directed a new perspective of how we look at things from pre-MySpace to current. I was looking and reading about Redfin and how that has actually affected, and I know this is not a scientific example per se, but how interesting it is it's affected and given the power of the buyer back to that into that court where it used to be always the seller being like, I can mark this up, I can mark this up. Now Redfin's come in and said,
Right, exactly. Yep.
And will you feel that research will take that kind of direction, will give the patients that kind of platform to go and create a type of feedback group or a platform where you can say, I didn't feel like this was very efficacious, or I did, concern even that would come into play too, where the positive and the negative line draw.
Yep. And so I think if you look at the trends over the last 20 years of history, the trend is towards greater transparency, right? And that shows up in the fact that you can now determine exactly what the invoice price is for a car that you're thinking about buying. And it used to be that the invoice was actually locked in the safe, and even the salesperson didn't know what they paid for the car, right? So the trend is towards greater and greater transparency. And yet, we have to be really careful about what people do with that transparency. Because, number one, there are charlatans out there who will claim that vaccination causes autism when the science clearly shows otherwise. And we have to be careful about that transparency because people need to be helped to understand what this data means and the need for a control group in a clinical trial. If people don't understand why that control group is there, they're going to want to step back. Oh, I might not be getting anything that's going to help me. So, yes, the trend is towards greater transparency, and that puts even more importance on being clear in our communication. Other questions or comments? Yes?
I deal with a lot of recruitment, obviously, with the studies I work on. And if you can take insurance versus going into a study, then more people are apt to go into insurance and forego the study. And these are even in real simple trials, not necessarily the ones that I was working on.
Yeah.
Have you heard that?
I have not heard that, and that's interesting, though I can see how patients would have that attitude. It's like, why put myself at risk when I've got a, quote, sure thing, right? Yeah. So Obamacare is this huge political football that has been kicked around and kicked around and kicked around. I'm not even going to touch that one. Other comments or questions?
I think that particular issue ties into the lack of investigator participation as well. You know, because patients only know what investigator kind of informed them, and I think
Yep.
it could be that if you could get greater investigator participation, that would just drown out any concern about insurance and things like that.
It is
Right.
always about education.
Yep.
Even at the site level.
Yep.
With sponsors, between sponsors and sites.
And so in many ways, the first thing we need to do is we need to market clinical trials to investigators, and not only talk about the benefits of that, but talk about how to talk about clinical trials. Other comments or questions? Yes?
So I'm kind of curious about sort of using the actual patients that are involved in the clinical trials. How are they communicating with other potential,
Yeah,
patients?
that would be a fascinating topic for research.
You know, we have people that come to our studies. They're very excited when they get there. They start doing the study. It would be nice if they could inform their friends, or they could tell others. And we have that potential with social media. But there again, there's the issues of privacy, right? So
Right.
if they're involved in the clinical trial, do they want to share that information?
That's right. Yep. Yeah, it's a fascinating challenge, and there is no silver bullet, no magic solution, no pixie dust that we can wave our wand and it's boom, it's done. Because the change that's coming at us is multifaceted, and so single point solutions typically don't work in that kind of environment that is undergoing its grand sea change. Yes?
David, you deal with a lot of life sciences companies, and most of us are in one form or another a very regulated industry.
Yeah.
So when you think about getting to the "we are the safe ones" message, how do we balance the requirements of the regulations and the fact that clinical trials are more and more complex with addressing that core message?
I wish I had the answer. At some level, this is a common problem, by which I mean a problem that is relating to the commons, right? The square around which everybody used to build their houses, in which we all used to graze our sheep. And so I think there's a significant role for government here. And Obamacare could have done a better job with including clinical trials as part of the prescription for what ails America. I'm very hesitant to kick things down the road or across the fence to the government, because it's not a fast-acting solution. It's time release. I don't know if that answers your question at all. Other comments? Thank you very much.